Hi, everybody. Brenton Ackman here with the College Autism Network. Glad to have you for this really big presentation. We have a whole team of folks out of CUNY, College of Staten Island, here to talk about exploratory writing, as they put it, a key employment skill for some autistic college students. And it's a participatory process. We're going to learn from Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch, Seri Shevchuk-Hill, Ellie Grossman, the team to talk about their research during our time today. But we're going to start it off as we always do here. In case you're new to the Canvas community, welcome. We know many of you are returners, and you know that we often start off with a little bit of an icebreaker activity in the chat to try to foster some further community and engagement. We really want to make sure that you feel engaged today, whether you're just sitting back and watching or have a question or a comment. Feel free to use the chat, speak up. We want to hear from all of you. And our icebreaker for today is the following, and I'll put it in the chat as well, which is, what is the best book that you have read this year? And if you haven't read a book this year, that's okay. Maybe something that's recently something you've enjoyed or even revisited. But good chance to get some recommendations from the group and get everybody engaged. So feel free to put that in the chat, or if you want to share verbally, you're welcome to do that too. I think we're actively contemplating what was our favorite books so far. So it looks like Mark has read a good autobiography. Lori says Unmasking Autism. Yep, that's on my bookcase. Ariel likes the Wayward Children series. Another neurodiversity pick from Juliet, Different, Not Less. Enchantment by Catherine May is Greta's recommendation. Katie read Boys in the Boat. Yeah, I've heard about that one too. Kathy has opted for a Bell Hooks piece, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice of Freedom. Lots of good selections. So this might be an opportunity for folks to write down some of those recommendations if you're in the mood for any of those genres. Awesome. Well, just a few updates from all. Feel free to contribute, putting in the chat if you like. A few updates from all of us at College Autism Network. We know we're going to see many of you at the College Autism Summit in a few weeks in Nashville, so we look forward to that opportunity to be in person with folks again. We continue to encourage you, if you feel so inclined, to sign up for a formal College Autism Network membership, which affords you a number of different benefits, including discounts for the summit and some other webinars and perks throughout the year. So that is featured in our meeting agenda if you want to take a look at that further. And if you're not already on our listserv, definitely be sure to do so, because that's how you're going to hear about our forthcoming meetings, as well as have easy access to these recordings once they're posted, usually about a week after the presentation time. So we'll turn it over to all of you. If you have anything you'd like to share, we have the space for folks to share resources with one another, to share if you've read any journal articles that you've enjoyed. If you've written and published something, feel free to share that here. If there's a resource you want to pass along to the group, if you have a great announcement to share, we also love celebrating folks. I see that there's already a few in the chat, or excuse me, a few in the meeting agenda that have been posted by folks. So I'll read them aloud, and if anybody in attendance wants to share more context on that, you're welcome to do so. And you're also welcome to share something verbally, even if you haven't posted in the meeting agenda. And I see that Ariel and Jacob they're sharing information about their autism and employment in Michigan study. And there's a link to the flyer. I'm not sure if either of them have any details that they'd like to offer further right now, but you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, this is Ariel. This is the same study that those of you who saw me on the call a year ago or so we were recruiting for. I was at a different university then, and now I'm at Michigan State University. So we've just restarted recruitment, and we're looking for people in the central or mid-Michigan area who are autistic and who have experience with work or seeking work, or people who work in that area, whether they're autistic or not, like professionals and advocates. We love to talk to you. So, or anybody you know who might be interested. Sorry, it's only pretty geographically restricted right now, but we hope to, have some good results that we can maybe share here a couple years down the line.
Absolutely. Hopefully it's not that far down the line. Hopefully sooner. But thank you for sharing and spreading the word. Yes, fingers crossed. Absolutely. Yeah, be sure to share the word. And I see also we have a multiple studies from Jinx, a PhD candidate at Bowling Green State. If you'd like to share any details here about the work, you're welcome to do so.
Sure. My dissertation is going to be on looking at representations of autistic people through fictional characters on TV. It's going to be kind of drawing on Noah Sasson and Catherine Crompton's work in First Impressions and Rapport, sort of translating it to fictional characters and parasocial contact theory. But that has a lot of assumptions. So first, I need to sort of weed out some of the confounding factors around storylines. So the short impressions of video clips. It's basically a bunch of clips from shows with autistic characters. It's just like 20 seconds of video, and then is one better than the other? Does the dialogue make you think you should be rooting for someone else? So I can kind of take out any of the clips where the plot is actually what's influencing your opinion versus having it be like the actual nonverbal communication and appearance being the influencer in the actual dissertation. And the experiences with forms and rating scales is a leftover for me from last year also that I just kind of never got around to finishing up. So I need about another 20 autistic people to even out my sample. And it's because the scales used in media effects research are widely used and considered reliable and valid, but I can go through every single one of them and identify statements that I would never be able to answer because they're just too ambiguous. Like, I feel this way about the characters, but what if you feel differently about different characters? So this study actually just ask you a couple of questions about generally your experiences, which will add to the literature on autistic people and their relationship to forms. But then here are some media effect rating scale items. Just would it be easy to answer or hard to answer? And then if you want to share like what you don't like about a statement or what makes it good, you can, but you don't have to. So people do it really fast. The inclusion criteria are that you need to be over 18. That's it for both of them. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, James. Those sound like really cool studies. Great. And I see that Matt has posted in the agenda, sharing a link to a recent publication that has some thematic connections to today's presentation. So thank you for providing that information to folks. Anything else that folks would like to share? Sounds like there's lots of good empirical research going on right now. We always like to hear that, and certainly keep us surprised per what was referenced earlier. Perhaps could be the foundation for a future Canvas presentation too. Any other contributions folks would like to share out? Okay, I think we're all still processing the great studies that are being offered. So thinking about how we can direct folks to partake in this. Well, if any other items come up, you're welcome to put those in the chat. But I'm going to turn it over at this point to our guest presenters. So we have a whole team here from the College of Staten Island, the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. We're really happy that they could be here today. And we also appreciate that we recognize that we had delayed this meeting by a week. And we're really just glad to have everybody here for a presentation from this team on exploring writing, a key employment skill for some autistic college students, and the participatory process. So we have Seri Shevchuk-Hill, who's a graduate student at the College of Staten Island in CUNY. We have Dr. Kristen Gillespie-Lynch, an associate professor at the College of Staten Island and the Graduate Center at CUNY, and Ellie Grossman, PhD candidate at the Graduate Center at CUNY. So we're excited to learn about their work. We invite you to input questions and comments in the chat as they emerge. We'll allocate the latter part of the meeting for those questions to be addressed. So feel free to start inputting those as they come to mind. And oh, wonderful. So Ellie mentions in the chat, Felix Jensen, who is a collaborator on the photo voice study, who's here with us as well. Yeah, glad you could be here too, Felix. All right, I'm going to turn it over to the team now and enjoy. I'm looking forward to it.
So my name is Seri, as I've already been introduced, and I'll be talking about a paper that I co-wrote with Kristen and a couple of other co-authors that aren't here today, on comparing the narrative writing of autistic and non-autistic college students. So prior research has mostly prioritized narratives spoken by autistic children and focused on identifying autistic challenges while ignoring potential autistic strengths, and interpreted its findings through the theoretical lens of the hypothesis that autistic people have a reduced theory of mind. And this line of research has suggested that autistic children struggle in their narrative abilities due to what the researchers saw as difficulties with emotional understanding and theory of mind. Studies examining the quality of autistic writing, there was a meta-analysis, and it suggested that autistic individuals produce shorter writing samples and produce writings of worse quality. However, I think that shorter writing samples can be viewed as a strength since it indicates that people are being concise, which is a good thing in a lot of cases. And the quality was measured in a very subjective way, and the studies did it in different ways across the meta-analysis. In an earlier study in our lab, which Kristen led, it found that autistic university students produced higher quality persuasive writing samples than non-autistic university students. And other strengths found have been by two studies finding that autistic individuals' language was more varied, and also Kristen's earlier study finding that autistic university students tended to be more perfectionist in their writing. In our study, we aimed to move away from examining theory of mind in the writing of autistic students, and we examined narrative writing and expected autistic students to make fewer grammatical errors, show greater lexical variation, using more uncommon words, and using more specific emotional language, and using more adjectives due to being more detail-oriented in their descriptions. We aimed to explore whether autistic students would differ in the frequency with which they refer to sensory details in their writing, and we also examined associations with writing affect. We used the same sample as Kristen's prior study did, but that study focused on persuasive writing, whereas the study focused on narrative writing. The participants were all at a US university and pursuing associate's and bachelor's degrees, and there were no statistically significant differences in terms of their demographics. The measures we used was a writing task where we asked the participants to please write a very short story, and their responses were entered into Microsoft Word with autocorrect enabled. We then coded those responses. In addition to that, the participants filled out surveys and standardized assessments. We used automated coding to code the syntactic errors and punctuation errors, as well as the frequency of common and rare words. along with the frequency of adjectives and similar codes that could be done via software. Additionally, we utilize qualitative coding, which was done using content analysis. And the first draft was developed by 2 coders, blinded to participant characteristics. And we used a deductive approach based on prior literature and consulting with the writer. Further drafts were revised with feedback from an autistic collaborator and Kristen, who's the faculty advisor. The qualitative coding fell into holistic codes that looked at the overall writing sample and frequency codes. For the holistic codes, we looked at how fictional the writing sample turned out to be and the aspects of the story arc. Within the frequency codes, we had to split each sample into segments, and then the writing was coded segment by segment. We examined the frequency of emotional language with subcodes aimed to examine levels of specificity, as well as sensory details with subcodes, looking at the sensory details as they relate to the 5 senses. Some of that detail captured that we aimed to capture in those subcodes had to be lost, since this simple emotional language and social emotional language, along with smell and taste, did not come up often enough for us to say that we have good reliability on those subcodes. In terms of results, we found that the writings of autistic and non-autistic students were more similar than they were different. In the categorical variables, surprisingly, we noticed that autistic students were less likely to have a clear point of climax in their story arcs, at least the way that we were reading those stories. For the other variables, we found in terms of participant characteristics that the autistic students had higher writing affect, nonverbal intelligence, and reading comprehension. They produced fewer syntactic errors and used fewer common words in their writing, and produced writings that measured higher in reading level. However, they did not differ significantly from non-autistic students on other measures of lexical complexity. Therefore, we found support for our hypothesis that autistic students will produce grammatical errors less frequently than non-autistic students. And while there was some support for our second hypothesis that autistic students would produce more lexical variability and use complex words more frequently than non-autistic students, it was not fully supported. And our sub-hypothesis that they would use more specific emotional language and use more adjectives were not supported at all. Rather than coding sensory detail from the beginning, we had initially attempted to code for imagery, but it was difficult to agree on a shared definition of imagery for us. And although it was still challenging to obtain reliability with some of the less commonly appearing sensory details, such as taste and smell, this was more straightforward than attempts to define imagery. And further research should examine sensory detail more rigorously by collecting sensory profiles and seeing how the sensory details included in the stories might relate to the writer's sensory profiles. There were some limitations to our study. It was a small sample, and which increases the chance of type 2 errors. So all the findings are exploratory and will require future research to confirm and replicate them. Additionally, the sample consisted of students of one college, and it was predominantly male, as well as participants did not have the opportunity to revise their work, which is what you generally do in the writing process. So results might not represent participants' actual writing ability, as many of the issues observed in the writing samples could have been eliminated in future drafts. So future research could include a longitudinal study of writing process. In conclusions, the findings suggest that the writing of autistic and non-autistic students is more similar than different, including in how varied it is. Individuals, autistic or otherwise, should make time to pursue creative fictional writing if they enjoy it, and it may help them build writing skills while allowing them to engage in an activity they enjoy. We think that working on fictional writing could help build writing affect, improve writing skills, and transfer that to other modes of writing as well. So parents and teachers should encourage this activity. Also, educators and administrators should ensure that typing technologies are available to students so those who find handwriting challenging are not barred from learning other writing skills. For future study, applied research should focus on creating and exploring the efficacy of fiction-based typed writing supports for autistic as well as non-autistic students. And research should examine writing more holistically, focusing on the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Seri. That was great. A lot of information packed in there. Great to learn from you all. Let's turn it over to if anybody has any questions. It might be useful to continue to keep the slides up there, Seri, in case
we also are moving on to Ellie's part of the presentation right now. So
great. Okay.
Maybe best to do that first before questions.
Yeah, I would agree. Let's shift it over one step ahead.
If that works for folks, I'm open to whatever. But I'm happy to keep moving.
Yeah, Ellie, go for it. I think that will work out just fine. So I think I'll just encourage folks to have some of the thoughts that Seri just shared in the back of your mind and type those out in the chat if you'd like, and we'll turn it over to you, Ellie.
All right, cool. So I was introduced earlier, but I'm Ellie. If you happen to see Eliana on the slide, the same person. So I'm going to pick up where Seri left off because I'm very acutely interested in the process of writing and making it accessible, because that's the point in my project that I'm up against right now. So this question, what are some ways that we can make the process of writing participatory and accessible, is one that I want to pose to all of you. If you'll indulge me, after I sort of walk you through our study, I wanted to sort of have a group think about ways that we can make this process of disseminating results participatory, and specifically that process of writing. So what I'm going to do is I'll walk you through the participatory project that we ran last spring, where we used art, or we examined using art as a tool to understand neurodivergent experiences of creativity and work. And again, I just want to mention, I'm presenting alongside Felix Jensen, who's here on our call now. And Felix was and is a collaborator on the study, and he can speak to his experience at the end of the talk about being on this project if folks have questions. But all of the people that are listed are a part of the project. The folks who are here are bolded. So the impetus of this work was about using the arts to address the chronic employment gap that is faced by neurodivergent, specifically autistic people who struggle to obtain and maintain meaningful employment. And we know that this is a problem in general, but it's all the more confusing when you consider the importance of creativity at work and autistic people's potential and propensity for creativity. So I wanted to know, can we combat the autistic creativity gap by equipping autistic young adults with skills to be creative at work? So when I started looking into this work, it became apparent very quickly that I wouldn't really be able to look into much prior research to find these answers. I'm sure it's not a surprise to many of you that a lot of autism research is not participatory, meaning that it doesn't include input from autistic people. So I instead opted for a neurodiversity approach to the work, where it's imperative that all neurodiversity work should be participatory and involve neurodiversity stakeholders. In other words, no research about us without us. So I chose to take this on by conducting a participatory project using a methodology called photo voice, which some of you might have heard about. And that utilizes focus groups and photography to establish quote unquote participants as experts of their own experience, who take a leading role in research processes from beginning to end with the ultimate goal for social change. And I say participants in these exaggerated quotes because you'll never actually hear me refer to anybody on this project as a participant, because we want to mitigate that participant researcher power dynamic. And instead, everybody is a collaborator who brings their own expertise to the table. Now, this photo voice process sounded well and great, but I wanted to look into how others who've conducted photo voice projects have implemented these goals of participatory work in social change. And unfortunately, according to a recent meta review of photo voice, a lot of them actually haven't. So what often happens is that collaborators with lived experience are not involved in data analysis or the dissemination of findings, which are two primary engines for social change. Aside from that, I also have a personal gripe with photo voices, or what I would call overemphasis on using photography for self-expression. So in traditional photo voice projects, collaborators will take photos to capture the content of their life experiences. And from an accessibility perspective, photos are great because self-expression isn't dependent on reading or writing skills necessarily. But you could also argue that that sole reliance on photography might actually exclude people who prefer to express themselves verbally or in some different way. So it became clear that if I wanted to do photo voice, I'd have to revise the process to address these critiques. So this led me to explore how photo voice could be implemented in a more participatory way than it has been in the past. And I was curious about what strategies might promote participatory engagement, but also the obstacles that make participatory engagement challenging. And of course, I was also interested in what skills neurodivergent college students felt were important for creativity at work and why, and how they'd recommend teaching those skills to neurodivergent people. So this project took place last semester with 8 neurodivergent young adults that are affiliated with Project Reach at CUNY. And that's a program that supports autistic college students in learning the skills that they want to learn and also fostering a sense of community. So over the course of 9 weeks, we all met, 4 researchers included, to select our research foci, share artwork, and analyze it for themes. I love that suggestion, Ariel, of taking screenshots. So together as a team, we adopted this revised photo voice approach. And here our innovations and decisions are written in pink, and I can pull out a couple of them for you to focus on. So you can see that the second step replaces photographs with artwork to give choice and self-expression back to collaborators. So screenshots would have been great, writing pieces are great, art pieces are great. It's really whatever the collaborator decides is their preference for communication. You'll also see that the third step omits a typical method of data analysis in favor of one that's more iterative and accessible, and I'll discuss that one in a moment. And then finally, that fifth step illuminates the importance for us to set the expectation from the beginning that dissemination is a group effort. And that's going to be that writing component that I'm interested in exploring at the end. So there were 4 primary takeaways from this study, 1 that was pretty process-based, and then 3 that were outcome-based. So first, we really found that taking an iterative approach to photo voice was necessary for the work to actually be participatory. So each meeting that we designed was based on those helpful strategies, but obstacles that promoted accessibility and participatory engagement that we were learning along the way. So it was very iterative. And our plan is ultimately to synthesize these strategies and obstacles to create guidelines for future researchers that recommend processes and identify pivotal decision points, with the caveat that it's always going to need some degree of iterativity. But I thought it might be interesting to walk you through just one example of what our iterative process looks like in practice. You are fine to go on to the next slide, Kristen. I'm over talking. So what I can do is just fast forward through our process a little bit. So during meetings 1 and 2, as a group, we identified skills that folks need to be creative at work. One of them was interpreting emotions and intentions. So over the course of the next week, the group created art, defining it however they saw fit, to respond to 2 questions. The first being, what helps you learn how to interpret emotions and intentions? And why might interpreting emotions and intentions be important at work? In meeting 3, we met to analyze those works that everybody created. Now, we were initially going to use what's called the SHOWed method of data analysis, and you can see that on the left, which is the most common method of data analysis in photo voice. But when we actually took a look at those questions, we actually found them pretty esoteric and not actually helpful for answering the questions we were interested in answering with our research. So we devised a new method for analyzing each person's work to extract themes that were directly related to our research questions. And you'll also see that that last question is crossed out because we ended up phasing it out later when we realized it wasn't actually helpful for folks. So we also had a few outcomes that were illuminated from the artwork that the group made. And I can read through these quickly so we can start talking together. The first is that the group identified similar skills as important for workplace creativity as the literature suggests, which is cool. And those things include perspective taking and collaboration. Secondly, we identified some strategies to teach neurodivergent people how to be creative at work, which were providing opportunities for iteration, communication, collaboration, and context-based learning. And then finally, the group identified strategies to help employers support neurodivergent employees, like providing opportunities for open communication regarding expectations and accommodations. And what we ultimately want to do is create a worksheet for neurodivergent young adults to help them facilitate those conversations at work with their employers to advocate for themselves. So Felix and I are happy to discuss these findings further if you have any questions. But that's the end of my project run through. And as I said, if you'll indulge me, we want to open up the discussion with all of you by returning to that question I posed at the beginning. So at this point, we're at the last phase of our study where we need to, as a group, write this up and disseminate it to relevant stakeholders in the autistic neurodivergent community. And we're still figuring this out. What does it mean to make the process of writing actually participatory and accessible? We've considered different things, but we would love to open it up and hear from all of you. What does accessible participatory writing look like?
Wonderful, Ellie. Thank you. That's great. Are we opening it up to questions now? Okay, I want to be mindful of. Okay, so at this point, let me put my video feedback on. What questions and ideas, it sounds like, might you have for Ellie and Seri and the whole team? It seems like it will be great to just invite conversation around all of these different topics. And I think it might also be helpful in folks' questions or comments to also be really precise in terms of what study or what components they're specifically putting forward so that the team can best address those. And I know there's been a lot going on in the chat. So I'll try to call out some of these, but feel free if others want to chime in. I see that Matthew has their hand raised first right now, so we'll attend to that question. Matthew, if you want to turn your mic on, and then we'll turn it over to some of the questions that are in the chat here.
Sure. Thank you, Brett. And thank you both for such a breadth of different types of really writing autistic experiences and really some needed work, which which is awesome to see. I think my question, more of it's half question, half suggestion. I'm curious to thoughts for both studies is kind of setting the context around writing outside of school-based expectations of writing. I think in both of your situations, you're talking about the worthwhileness of writing, but some of the studies being cited from autistic writing research, the main limitation of our field as a subdiscipline of autism and literacy work in general is we tend to only think about school-based writing. We tend to assume in a lot of studies as well that the context comes back to school-based expectations of transcription and text generation and student-teacher back and forth and things like that, such as the meta-analysis you had highlighted where kind of, there's shorter writing, but a lot of that came from psychoed assessments of writing compared to non-autistic and autistic individuals. And so my big push, I'd be curious to both of your thoughts on really, setting the context around the expectations for what writing does in these spaces in the professional lens, as well as in kind of college age students, but not necessarily in like college level writing class situations of kind of expressing ideas in certain ways. And be curious to just general thoughts or how you're starting to kind of wrestle with, I think you're all kind of talking a lot about how this is situated in the autism literature, neurodiversity literature really well. But I'm still trying to figure out exactly that kind of the writing component of it in many ways.
Were you going to go or am I going to go?
Feel free to answer.
Okay, so let me see if I get what you're laying down. School-based writing, specifically a writing class, where you're writing essays based on whatever book and whatever theme that writing professor wants you to learn. That's a limitation to the research, correct? Or is it school itself?
School itself, that might be English language arts, for example, or the writing that takes place in a school context in that way.
Okay, so let's focus on special interests. We still might be in the schoolhouse, but what if we look at a special interest related to that student's major? And I don't mean in my case, it wouldn't be any random political science class, but if I was the person, you would look at what I wrote related to an independent study or something related to warfare or politics of terrorism class in particular. Why don't we look at non-traditional forms of writing? Like, what if someone's into online role play, but not voice-based, like play-by-post or even Discord or IRC chats back when IRC was still a thing? You could probably glean something from that, although gathering data in that form might be harder, but doable. You're just going to have to figure that one out by getting involved in those communities and reaching out to gaming groups, which one problem I can already see with that is if you're doing what's the term, longitudinal study, like over time? Yeah, games start and stop suddenly. So you might have to try to track certain participants over time, but you're focused on the writing, so it doesn't matter what game session they're in necessarily so much as how they write in different scenes. Professional writing, that was a good idea, but in what settings? Are we talking corporate? Are we talking government? What type of government work? There's certain stuff that's proprietary, and if we're talking government, there's a point where that writing may become classified depending on the participant's job. You may not have access to all of their writing, but we can definitely broaden the scope. I agree.
I also wanted to share that originally we wanted to look at fictional writing specifically, but the responses we got, since our prompt was to just write us a story, so the responses we got were pretty varied, which is what led us to code fictionality of the piece in the first place, because some were very like grounded in reality, just like describing something that might have happened to them the other day, while others were like purely fantastical pieces with like all so. And I didn't get to go into those findings as much, but we found certain correlations between highly fictional work and the writing affect. of the participants. So while we were collecting data in the school setting, I feel like we got some very varied responses, and I just wish there were more of them. But the other thing is, in terms of interpreting the data, I feel like I do have to concede there that we definitely jump to how can this be relevant to school? How does this impact school? Even though I think we all believe that fictional writing for its own sake as well is really valuable, and like other facets of writing are important as well.
Can I go, Ellie?
I was just going to say quickly, I'm thinking about sort of that school academia context as well. Maybe not in as nuanced of a form as Seri and Felix, but I'm thinking about when we talk about disseminating works to relevant stakeholders who has access to that dissemination. So, and access can look different ways. So research is gatekept in general. A lot of non-researchers don't know how to access research publications, but also the style of writing that we write in, is that actually accessible to a wide group of people? And so when I hear, school-based writing and academia and academic-based writing, I'm thinking about how we can write this paper together in a way that the process is not school-based and achievement-based, but also in a way that a lot of people can understand it. Sorry, Felix, I don't know if I cut you off.
You're fine. Quick fix there on, I'm going to bounce off your immediate point, then I'll go back to what I was saying regarding Seri's research. I don't know if it'll survive peer review because I'm not that familiar with academic culture, and I only have a very negative view of it because a reviewer too must be stopped on Facebook. Yeah, those guys are a hoot. Anyway, they told us this in the Navy repeatedly when we were going through A school, which is like job-specific training, mainly to mock us, but also probably true. I'd have to get sources on this one. You're being taught at the 8th grade level, usually followed with, why are you having so much trouble getting this? So if you want it to be more accessible, literally make it more accessible. Make it accessible at the layman level or even lower. Go. Can you doubt it's accessible if it's at the 8th grade level? I'm not saying drop that low, but why not? As long as it's understood. Who cares how much extra words you have to write or what some reviewer thinks about it. As far as the value of, well, what fictional writing versus non-fictional writing versus anything in between, yeah, you could factor it all into one study, or you could focus on one thing at a time and just do a series and then bring it all together later. I mean, you don't have to get overwhelmed. Focus on one thing at a time, change lanes, keep it interesting.
Really great conversation going on. We have some other questions that are emerging, and I want to turn it over. I see Ariel's hand has been raised for a while, so we'll turn it over to Ariel. And then I see in the chat that Jay and Lauren have questions as well. So we'll go in that order. Go ahead, Ariel.
So I feel a little bad, Ellie, because I was going to ask another question instead of answering your question. So I'll try to trade a little bit and say, your question's one that I share. I can tell you some of the things I've tried, and maybe we can just like bounce ideas off of the whole group here. So one thing that I've done with collaborative writing is make like worksheets that are really structured. That go along with the document, so that instead of I'll send a document and say like, hey, here's the draft, like please give feedback or contribute or do your part. And for some people that is really great, and they'll write on the document, or they'll write something separate from the document based on the document, kind of free form. But we also have a form. Some people do like to have more specific questions throughout, and so it will say, I always put like, what should we add, what should we remove, what should we change, which I think is making explicit how I look at a document when I'm revising it, rather than just like revise, whatever that means. And then it would also have specific questions, and I color code it. So, you know, things you like in the green box, things you don't like in the red box. Another thing that I've done recently with folks with intellectual disability, not necessarily autism, in addition to that, has been like having a conversation and then like tasking someone to try to recap that conversation, then like return what we've written, how we're going to use it. Is it still okay to use your name? Do you not want to use your name? Like, as kind of a collaborative process, which I think is going well, but I feel a little, I feel personally like a little more anxious about that one. I like to have a little more structure myself. And so then I'm also thinking about like, what are my needs, and how do we work together. All of that was aside from what my question is. I'm sorry I'm talking for a long time, but Matthew and Felix's conversation really inspired me to a question that I've had for a long time, and I thought of, Ellie, when you started your part of the presentation about creativity and work, which is just something about like, how have you all in your work addressed the idea of creativity as work, or like work in the arts or in creative fields? Because I think there's a lot that is going on in like the autism and employment landscape, like research landscape, about like getting a job in the arts, and some of that I think is really empowering, and some of that I think is a little bit like, I'm gonna put this really bluntly and don't take it out of context when you use this recording later, but like, oh, just go and be a starving artist. And so like kind of dismissive sort of thing. And so I just wondered, like, what have you found in talking with people about how they use creative writing, or is it a hobby and it should be separate from work? Which we've also encountered a little bit in our study, that like you don't want to make your fun thing into a work thing. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
You've just touched on my existential crisis. So I think
Yeah,
about
me
this.
too.
I think about this all the time. I identify as neurodivergent, not autistic, but something that I've really come up against, and I'm just speaking purely anecdotally because I just got excited by your question and comment, is the stigma that comes within with going into the arts versus going into academia. So I pursued the arts my whole life until I, right at the last second, was like, nope, academia sounds cool. But in terms of job stability and having structures of safety, both like physical structures of safety, emotional structures of safety, mental health structures of safety, I find the arts to be much more stigmatized, and for job insecurity to be discussed far more often than it is in academia. But I don't actually feel safer in academia. And I also perceive that there's much less judgment. So when I would tell people I would go into the arts, I would get the, well, how much money do you think you're going to make? Versus when I tell people I'm getting a PhD, there's a level of reverence that comes along with it. People don't ask questions. So I find that the narrative that I was given in both of these worlds was a little bit cockeyed. But I also was a part of a paper where we talked about patterns of vulnerabilities and strengths of people in the arts. Vulnerabilities being barriers to well-being, like money, and job security, but also these strengths like resilience. So I don't know. I think about it a lot. I don't know if that made any sense.
Definitely. I'm taking notes here on also how stigma plays into this discourse. Great point.
Continually great conversation going on in the chat as well, and it's hard for me to even keep up. So there were some comments. Jay mentions the value of looking at writing within tabletop role-playing games. Further reinforcement that reviewer too can sometimes be a negative individual. Lauren has a question. In the first study's recommendations, can you expand on wanting to look at the analysis of the parts of the story more? Maybe the team can elaborate on that.
I would love to answer the question. However, I am finding myself a little bit confused by the wording.
Hi, yeah, I couldn't remember exactly how you had the recommendation worded. So I don't know if you can pull up that slide, but it looked like y'all were wanting to analyze or look at more of maybe the components. I couldn't tell. It was kind of broadly written too. I guess that's why I wanted to wanted a little bit more information.
I think
Yeah.
that was that the part that you were asking about?
Yeah. So what did you mean exactly about focusing on the process of writing? Just more
So-
interested in that. Yeah.
Yeah, so what I felt like was a huge limitation for us when coding the data was that we just had the end results. There was no information about what went into the writing for the person, no information on where they were going with it, what approach they had used, what future edits would bring to the work potentially. And the whole time we were doing that, I was kind of thinking in my mind that it's like you don't generally sit down and write something because somebody tells you to write a story, and you definitely don't expect that to be good. And if you want to write a story, you generally want to go through a number of edits and probably have somebody read over your work as well, which all to me is part of the writing process, and it's how I do writing, be it academic or not. And to me, kind of, it would be, I feel like it would be great to get all those pieces and to see how they will integrate feedback or iteratively go through that iterative process and rewrite their writing, or even where they're getting their ideas from and how they're putting them together. Because I think all of that impacts the writings that we get at the end. And for additional context, we had all kinds of different writings submitted where some of them were very abstract, kind of, a lot of them were very beautiful pieces of writing, and knowing in some cases there were disagreements between me and the other coder in terms of whether it's a great piece of writing and we get exactly what this person was going for, and the other coder being like, what? I don't understand where this person was going for at all, and just think it's a completely confusing piece of writing, and does it work at all? Which was not something we were coding, but just general observations that were kind of being shared at that time. So I feel like having that piece there and being able to look at it more holistically as a process rather than just looking at the thing that was written down when we asked them to write us a story, could provide some very rich data.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, writing is a dynamic process, and the hard thing about research is that it's often static, right? So yeah, I totally get what you're saying. So I appreciate you expanding on that. Thank you.
I also don't have a solution for how to do that really well and within the constraints of that we have to have as research, but I do think it's important to think about how that can be done.
Well, we are nearing the hour mark, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. But I have to say, in all the years of Canvas, there have been few times where there's been this much conversation going on in the chat and so much back and forth dialogue and idea supporting. I think both of you and your team really demonstrated what rich participatory work looks like, with that iteration, with that sense of self-reflection, and really wanting to get it in the hands of a variety of different folks to be able to further build on your work. So really appreciate you all for being here today. It was very, very fascinating, and I think we're going to continue to learn from all of you. I know I need to continue to engage with the notes that I was furiously taking, and we'll be re-watching very soon. So thank you, Ellie and Seri and Felix and Kristen and the whole team for sharing this work with us. We're going to invite all of you to come back here in October for our October Canvas meeting. It is Friday, October 13th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to have Dr. Leslie Ann Bross from UNC Charlotte to talk about the effects of a peer coaching intervention for young adults with autism on a college campus. In the meantime, we'll hope to see you on the listserv. We'll be sending out a video recording of this later next week. And I'll look forward to hopefully seeing many of you then, and hope you all have a good weekend ahead.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.